They mocked Earth at the Council. Then humanity ended every treaty overnight. The laughter started before I even finished my sentence. I was standing at the floor of the Galactic Accord Council chamber on Thesavar Station, in the middle of presenting humanity's formal claim to Resource Zone 7, when Councillor Kron-Set of the Vithori delegation made a sound. It was not a polite interruption. It was not a question. It was a laugh. Long, slow, and deliberate. The kind of laugh that is meant to be heard by everyone in the room. The chamber held representatives from 46 species. Some of them turned to look at him. Others turned to look at me. A few did both, their eyes moving back and forth like they were watching something amusing play out, and did not want to miss a single moment of it. My name is Yara Voss. I have been the human ambassador to the Galactic Accord for 3 years. Before that, I spent 11 years in Earth's diplomatic corps, learning languages, studying alien customs, sitting through briefings so long and so dense that some of my colleagues compared them to a second education. I have shaken hands, touched antennae, pressed palms to bioluminescent skin, and bowed in 17 different ways depending on which species I was greeting. I know how to stay calm in a room full of beings that could, technically, end a conversation by simply removing me from the station. I am not easily rattled. But Councillor Kron-Set knew that, and he laughed anyway. He rose from his seat, which was a tall, curved structure built for a body twice the size of a human, and he spread his upper limbs in the gesture the Vithori use when they want to include the entire room in a private joke. He said, in Accord Common, the shared language of the Council, that he found it charming. He said that Earth's claim to Resource Zone 7 was ambitious. He used that word carefully, the way someone uses a word when they mean something much smaller and less kind. He looked around the chamber as he said it, letting his gaze travel from delegation to delegation, inviting everyone to share in the moment. Then he said that humanity had only achieved orbit 300 years ago. He said our contribution to Accord defense was decorative at best. He said that Earth should consider itself fortunate to operate civilian ships in protected corridors at all, given that without Accord escorts, our vessels would be navigating lanes that experienced civilizations had charted over centuries of real exploration. He sat down. The Dralvine delegation, who communicate through clicking sounds made with their lower feeding plates, produced a rapid series of clicks that the universal translation systems rendered into something like appreciative murmuring. The Storie, who are tall and silver-skinned and ancient by any measure, exchanged a look between their two representatives that I had learned, over 3 years, to read as quiet amusement. The Gessians, who held the chamber's mediating role for that session, said nothing at all. Their mediator, a broad and heavily built being named Prothek, did not reach for the gavel. He did not call for order. He let the moment breathe. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the joke. Not the room's reaction. The mediator's silence. The quiet confirmation that this was acceptable. That I was not owed a defense. That the oldest and most powerful members of this body considered the mockery of humanity's representative to be a reasonable part of an afternoon session. I looked at Councillor Kron-Set. I looked at Mediator Prothek. I looked at the room. Then I smiled. I closed my datapad. I said, in perfect Accord Common, that I appreciated the councillor's perspective, and that I would take his remarks under advisement. I gathered my materials. I stepped back from the presentation floor. I walked out of the chamber at a pace that I had practiced for exactly this kind of moment. Not hurried, not stiff, just a person with somewhere to go. In the corridor outside, I stopped. I pressed my back against the cool wall, and I breathed for a moment. Not because I was shaken. I was not shaken. I breathed because what I was about to do required clarity, and I wanted to be very, very clear. I opened my personal communicator. I scrolled to a contact that I had never used before. Not in 3 years of service. Not in 11 years before that. It was a contact that every human ambassador was given during their orientation briefing, in a quiet room, with no recording devices present, by a person who spoke in a low and careful voice, and said that this contact was to be used only when all other options had been exhausted or had become irrelevant. The contact was listed under a simple label, Office of Strategic Contingency. I typed 4 words. Invoke Protocol Pale Ember. I sent it. Then I put my communicator away and walked toward the station's observation deck, where the stars sat still and cold against the dark, and I watched them for a long time. My earpiece activated 40 minutes later. The voice on the other end was Admiral Hector Shendao, the commanding officer of Seoul Reserve Command. His voice was low, measured, and entirely without drama. He told me that Pale Ember was active. He told me the recall window was 6 hours. He asked if I wanted to recall the order. I said no. He said, simply, that he understood, and the line went quiet. I stayed on the observation deck for another hour. I watched the traffic of the station, the shuttlecraft and transport vessels and small diplomatic runners moving in and out of the docking arms. I watched a Vethori patrol ship slide past the station's outer ring, its hull polished and elegant in the way that all Vethori engineering tends to be. It was a beautiful ship, long and smooth, and clearly built by a civilization that had been building ships for over 1,000 years. I thought about what was coming. I thought about the word Kron-Set had used, decorative. He had no idea. That was the thing. He had absolutely no idea. I walked back to my quarters, sat down at my desk, and began drafting the formal withdrawal notifications that Earth's legal team had been quietly preparing for 2 years, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. The documents were thorough. They were precise. They had been reviewed by the best international law minds on Earth and cross-checked against every line of every treaty humanity had signed with the Accord. They were, in every legal sense, perfect. I sent the first draft to Earth's Foreign Ministry with a single note attached. The note said, "Tonight." Then I went to sleep, not because I was untroubled, not because the weight of what I had set in motion did not press against my chest like something solid, but because I had learned, a long time ago, that the work required of you the next day is rarely made better by spending the night in worry. The order was sent. The machinery was turning. There was nothing more I needed to do before morning. And in the morning, everything would be different. 6 hours after my message reached Earth, the Seoul Reserve Fleet began to move. Admiral Hector Shendao had a habit that his crew found strange. Every morning, before the shift briefing, before the reports, before the long chain of decisions that came with commanding the most powerful fleet in human history, he would stand at the forward observation window of his command ship and simply look at space. Not at star maps, not at tactical displays, just space. The plain, enormous, indifferent fact of it. He had been doing this since his first command, 31 years ago, when he was a young officer on a small patrol vessel in Earth's early orbital defense program. His captain at the time had asked him once why he did it. He had said that it helped him remember the scale of things. The captain had nodded and told him that was either very wise or very foolish, and that he would find out which later. He had decided, over 3 decades, that it was both. This morning, standing at the window of the command ship, he was not thinking about scale. He was thinking about a word, decorative. He had read the transcript of the council session within minutes of it being transmitted back to Earth. He had read it twice. Then he had sat in his chair for a long moment, and then he had gotten up and looked out the window. He had been in the Seoul Reserve for 14 years. He had watched it grow from a classified program with a handful of experimental ships into something that had no public name, no registered designation in any Accord database, and no official existence anywhere outside of the most restricted files in Earth's Defense Ministry. He had watched engineers push through problems that the galaxy's established civilizations had solved centuries ago, not by copying their solutions, but by arriving at better ones through the kind of determined, stubborn, slightly obsessive problem-solving that humanity seemed to produce naturally when it decided something needed to be done. He thought about the Vethori counselor saying that humanity's contribution to Accord defense was decorative. He thought about the 1,500 engineers who had spent 6 years developing a fold-step drive variant that was 40% faster than the Vethori original. They had started from first principles, working with captured technical data and their own theoretical models, and they had produced something that made the original look like a prototype. He thought about the graviton cannon program, developed entirely without Accord knowledge, tested in the deep shadow zones of the asteroid belt, tuned and refined over 8 years, until it could punch through any known class of shielding in the galaxy. He thought about the artificial intelligence fire control systems that ran on every ship in the reserve fleet, systems capable of processing combat decisions at speeds no biological crew could match, systems that turned each ship into something far more dangerous than the sum of its crew. He thought about the Cyber Warfare Division, which had spent a decade building tools specifically designed to work against every communications network, navigation system, and defensive array used by Accord member species. Not because Earth was planning to start something, but because Earth had learned, through centuries of its own history, that the civilizations that survive are the ones that plan for the worst and hope for the best. He pulled up the fleet status on his command display. 1,400 ships. They did not look like the sleek, elegant vessels that the Vithori favored, or the long and luminous craft the Suri operated, or the geometric precision of Dralvine engineering. Human ships were different. They were large, angular, and layered. The outer hull was thick, built from a composite that the engineers called practical, and the Accord observers, during the single inspection tour Earth had permitted 4 years ago, had called excessive. Beneath that was a secondary armor layer, then the shield systems, and then the internal structure of the ship itself, designed so that sections could be isolated and sealed without losing control of the whole vessel. The Vithori used pure energy shielding. It was beautiful technology. It was efficient. It deflected most weapons cleanly and required very little structural mass to support. Earth ships used energy shielding backed by physical armor. When the Vithori inspection team had seen this during the tour, their lead engineer had told Shen Dao politely that it was redundant, that if the shield failed, the situation was already beyond salvage, and the armor only added weight and reduced speed. Shen Dao had listened very respectfully and said that humans tended to plan for situations that were beyond salvage. The Vithori engineer had found this puzzling. Shen Dao had not explained further. The truth was that humanity's entire approach to military engineering was shaped by something the other species of the Accord did not fully understand, because most of them had never experienced it. Earth had spent the majority of its recorded history in conflict, not with alien species, with itself. Human nations had fought each other across centuries, with weapons that grew progressively more sophisticated and terrible, and the civilizations that survived had done so by learning to plan not just for winning, but for the situation where everything was going wrong, and you needed to keep fighting anyway. Redundancy, resilience, the ability to absorb damage that would end another ship's combat capability and still function. These were not inefficiencies. These were lessons written in blood across thousands of years of human warfare, compressed and refined, and finally applied to the design of starships by engineers who had studied history very carefully. The fold-step drives that the reserve fleet used were equally instructive. The Vithori technology they were based on allowed for near-instantaneous transit across short distances, repositioning a ship by folding local space around it. The original version required significant power cycling time between uses. The human variant had reduced that cycling time by 60%, allowing ships to fold multiple times in rapid sequence, appearing and disappearing within a combat zone in ways that made targeting them extremely difficult. They had not shared this improvement with the Accord. They had not shared the graviton cannons. They had not shared the fire control systems. They had not shared any of it, because sharing implied openness, and openness implied trust, and trust had to be earned through demonstrated good faith. The Accord had given humanity one seat at their table, observer status with the weight of a suggestion, and 14 years of being treated as a species that should be grateful for the invitation. They had not earned the full picture. Shen Dao looked at the fleet display. 1,400 ships, arranged in formations that would resolve into specific operational groupings once they began their fold sequences. The deployment plan had been prepared 2 years ago and reviewed 4 times since then, with adjustments made as the fleet grew and its capabilities expanded. Every corridor into human-adjacent space had been accounted for. Every Accord patrol pattern near Sol had been mapped, studied, and quietly worked around for years by survey ships that never filed their true routes with the Accord Navigation Authority. They knew where the patrols were. They knew the gaps. They had spent years making sure the gaps existed. Captain Yuki Maris, Shen Dao's second-in-command, stepped up beside him at the display. She was a compact woman with close-cropped hair, and the kind of focused calm that came from 15 years of commanding ships in situations that were not supposed to exist. She pointed to one of the corridor designations on the display and told him that the Vithori had a patrol line across Corridor 9, 40 vessels. They would be visible in that lane within the fold emergence window. He told her they would not be visible. She looked at him. She said that with respect, they could not just disappear from a space lane that a patrol was actively monitoring. He said to watch. The fold command went out to the fleet. Every one of the 1,400 ships folded at the same moment, using a precisely coordinated sequence that had been calculated and recalculated by the fleet's AI systems for weeks in advance. The corridor, which had been full of human ships one moment, was completely empty the next. And then, from the other side of the Vithori patrol line, the ships emerged, all of them, behind the patrol, past the monitoring stations, in the exact position they needed to be. Mara stood very still for a moment. Then she looked at the display, and then at the now empty corridor behind them, and then at the position markers showing where they were now. She said, quietly, that the Vithori were going to need to rethink some things. Shen Dao said that was the general idea. He opened a channel to the fleet. His voice was calm when he spoke to them. He told them they had trained for this. He told them they were not here to start anything. He told them they were here to end something that should have been settled a long time ago, without a single shot being fired, without a single life being lost, through the simple and overwhelming force of presence. He told them to hold formation, and then he sent a message to Ambassador Voss. He told her the fleet was in position. He told her the Vithori patrol line had been passed. He told her that whatever happened next was in her hands. The morning after I sent the withdrawal notifications, Thessavar Station was the quietest I had ever heard it. That was how I knew it had begun. The station was never quiet. In 3 years of living and working there, I had grown so accustomed to the constant noise of it, the hum of life support systems, the soft chime of translation networks, the distant sounds of a structure housing beings from 47 different worlds, that I had stopped noticing it. It was background. It was constant. It was simply the way a place that held the administrative heart of the Galactic Accord sounded. When I walked out of my quarters that morning, and the corridor was still and almost silent, I stopped and listened for a moment, and then I understood. The communications networks were down. Not the entire station infrastructure. The lights were on. The life support was running. The doors opened. But the Accord-wide communication relay, the network of nodes and routing stations that connected Thessavar to every member world, every fleet command, every diplomatic post and border station and relay outpost across the outer spiral, that network had gone quiet. 19 relay stations had gone offline at once. Every one of them was operated by humanity. We had not advertised this. We had not, at any point in 14 years of Accord membership, raised our hand in a council session and said, by the way, we now control the primary communication backbone for approximately 60% of this organization's long-range network. We had simply, over the course of 14 years, offered to build relay stations. We had offered to maintain them. We had offered to upgrade them when the existing technology fell behind the traffic load. We were good at it. We were reliable. The Accord had been glad to let us handle it, because handling infrastructure is unglamorous work, and most of the older civilizations in the Accord had long since stopped doing unglamorous work themselves. We had built the pipes. We had closed the valves. The effect was immediate and significant. The Gessian outer colonies lost contact with the homeworld. The Storie Fleet Coordination Network, which routed through 2 of the now offline relay stations, dropped to less than half capacity, which meant their warships could no longer receive coordinated tactical updates in real time. The Vithori diplomatic channels, which had always run through the relay node nearest to their home system for speed, were now facing a 40-minute delay on every transmission because the signal had to reroute through older, slower pathways that had not been the primary route in over a decade. I walked to the council chamber. The aide to the Vithori delegation, a young officer named Pel Rin, was running toward me from the far end of the corridor. He was not walking quickly. He was running. His long limbs covered the distance between us in a way that would have looked alarming if I had not been prepared for it. He said that Councillor Kron's set required my presence immediately. He said there was a situation with the communication network. He said that the ambassador's office needed to explain what was happening with the relay stations. I said that I would be happy to speak with the councillor. I said that as it happened, I was on my way to the chamber now. What I did not say was that by the time I arrived at the chamber, the formal withdrawal notifications had already been received by all 46 member species, every one of them, at the same moment, in their own languages, translated perfectly, by translation teams that Earth had been quietly assembling for 2 years. The notifications covered every treaty humanity had signed with the Accord since joining 14 years ago. Every one of them. The Accord Defense Cooperation Pact, the Shared Navigation Agreement, which governed the use of charted space lanes across the outer spiral, the Galactic Communication Relay Treaty, under which humanity had built and operated those 19 relay stations, the Non-Escalation Clause, which defined the limits of military positioning near member worlds, the Resource Zone Arbitration Framework, which was the treaty that Councillor Cronset had been laughing about the previous afternoon. All of them. Gone. In 6 hours. The chamber was not empty when I arrived. It was full. More full than I had ever seen it. Representatives who were normally in side offices or private meeting rooms had come to the floor. Some of them were communicating rapidly with their home worlds through personal equipment, though with the relay network down, those communications were taking far longer than usual. The noise in the room had a different quality from the usual council session. It was urgent and a little unsteady. I took my seat at the human delegation table. I opened my datapad. I looked calm, because I was calm. Councillor Cronset found me before the session was formally called to order. He crossed the floor with the long, smooth stride of his species, and he stood at the edge of the human delegation space, and he looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as recalculation. The amusement from the previous day was gone. In its place was something more careful. He said that the withdrawal notifications were a serious matter. He said that the Accord would not accept them without discussion. He said that there were processes, established frameworks, required periods of consultation before any member species could exit treaty obligations of this magnitude. I said that he was welcome to cite the specific treaty articles governing that process. He was quiet for a moment. I said that I was happy to wait while he looked them up. He knew, as I knew, that the treaty articles covering member withdrawal from specific obligations had been drafted in the early years of the Accord, when the organization was smaller and the treaties less complex. They had not been updated significantly since then. They did not include provisions for the simultaneous withdrawal from multiple agreements by a member species, because no one had imagined a scenario in which a member would do exactly that. The legal framework was, in this specific situation, not the obstacle that Cronset needed it to be. He said something different then. He said that humanity was one species against 46. He said that the Accord had resources, standing relationships, and military capacity that Earth could not hope to match. He said this without the theatrical performance of the previous day. He said it plainly, as a fact, in the tone of a being who is trying to communicate something important before the conversation takes a turn neither of them wants. I looked at him. I said, quietly enough that only he and the 2 Vithori aides standing behind him could hear, that I wanted to ask him something. He said to go ahead. I said, "How many of your communication networks did we build?" He said nothing. I said, "How many of your shipping lanes did we survey and add to the Accord navigation database?" He said nothing. I said, "How many of your border disputes did we mediate in the past 10 years, without taking credit, without asking for anything in return, because we wanted to be useful members of this organization, and we believed, for a while, that usefulness would be recognized?" He was very still. I said that he had told the council the day before that our military contribution was decorative. I said that he had been thinking about the wrong category of contribution. I said there was a difference between being decorative and being foundational, and that I was sorry it had taken this long for that difference to become visible to him. He said, and I could hear the shift in his voice, that humanity could not honestly believe that withdrawing from the Accord would serve its interests. He said we needed the Accord, we needed the protection, the trade relationships, the navigational access. I said that we had believed that once. Then my earpiece activated. Admiral Shendao's voice, very quiet, very steady, told me that the Vithori had moved warships into the Sol corridor. 40 vessels. He said they were holding position at the corridor mouth. He said it appeared to be a demonstration of resolve. I thought about that for a moment. Then I told the Admiral to let them see what was waiting for them. He said he understood. I looked at Councillor Cronset. I said that there was something happening in the Sol corridor that he might want to receive a report on, as soon as his communication channels were working well enough to receive it. I sat down and began reviewing the next set of documents on my datapad. The session was called to order 20 minutes later. For the first time in my 3 years at the Accord, every seat in the chamber was occupied. Even the delegations that normally sent only junior representatives had their senior members present. The Gessian mediator Prothik, who had said nothing the previous day while Kronset laughed, called for order in a voice that was noticeably more careful than usual. I sat at the human delegation table and I listened. And at the Sol corridor, 40 Vethori warships were learning something that I had known since the morning I first read the Pale Ember briefing, 3 years ago, the morning I understood what humanity had actually been doing during its 14 years of quiet, useful, decorative membership in the Galactic Accord. We had not been decorating. We had been preparing. I was there when the human ambassador left the chamber the previous day. I want to say this plainly, because it matters. I was at my station on the bridge of the Vethori warship Eternal Resolve, reviewing patrol assignments in Corridor 9, and I received the report of the council session transcript, the same way any officer of my rank receives such things, as part of the regular political briefing that Vethori fleet commanders are expected to stay current on. I read the transcript. I noted Councillor Kronset's remarks. I thought nothing particular of them, because they were consistent with the general opinion within the Vethori fleet regarding Earth's position in the Accord. My name is Sub-Commander Krellin Var. I have served in the Vethori Warfleet for 22 years. I was commissioned the same year that humanity joined the Accord, which I recognize now as a detail worth noting. I want to be honest about what I believed before that morning in the corridor. I believed that humans were a young species. I believed that young species, in the context of the Accord, were manageable. They had energy and ambition, and occasionally produced interesting ideas, but they lacked the deep civilization roots that come from centuries of space travel. They had not fought wars between star systems. They had not navigated the collapse of interstellar alliances or the slow entropy of ancient trade networks. They were newcomers, and newcomers, in my experience, understood their position. I believed humanity understood its position. The 40 ships that High Command sent into the Sol corridor were not there for combat. That needs to be clear. We were not authorized for engagement. We were sent to demonstrate that the Accord's senior members were prepared to take a firm posture in response to Earth's withdrawal notifications. The intention was presence. The intention was to position 40 Vethori warships at the entrance to human space, so that whatever conversations followed would happen with a very clear understanding of the balance of capability. This is a technique that works. I have seen it work. I have participated in it working. When the Dralvine disputed border territories with the Suri 40 years ago, before I was commissioned but well within living memory, the positioning of Vethori ships in the contested zone was enough to bring both parties to the table within a week. Presence communicates without words. It is efficient. It is, in the long vocabulary of interstellar diplomacy, a sentence that every advanced civilization has learned to read. We expected humanity to read it. We entered the Sol corridor at 0210 ship time, standard Accord calendar. The corridor itself is a navigational lane through a relatively quiet stretch of space, well charted, with no unusual gravitational features. My navigator had run the approach dozens of times on routine patrol. There was nothing about the corridor that should have produced what happened next. At 0340, my long-range sensors registered the first fold emergence. 1 ship. Then 10. I straightened in my command chair. Then 100. My sensor officer reported the number twice. He reported it a third time, because the display was producing figures that did not correspond to any intelligence estimate we had been given about human military capacity. The number kept growing. Ships emerging from fold transit, positioning themselves with precise and deliberate spacing, filling the corridor ahead of us, and on both flanks, and at the vector positions above and below the plane of our formation. I had been in 40 years of service. I want to be clear about that. I am not a young officer who panics at an unexpected reading. I am a Vethori sub-commander with 2 decades of command experience and the service record to match. I looked at that display, and I felt something that took me a moment to identify. It was awe, not fear, not quite. Awe, which is what you feel when a thing is so far outside the boundaries of what you expected that your mind needs an extra moment to catch up to your eyes. The ships were not elegant. I want to say that because it is an honest observation, and it matters for what I am about to describe. Vethori warships are built on principles of efficiency and grace. We have a saying in our engineering tradition that a beautiful ship is a well-designed ship. Because beauty in engineering emerges naturally from solutions that are correct. Our vessels are long and clean-lined, their hulls reflecting light in smooth curves, their systems integrated so that nothing protrudes unnecessarily from the outer structure. Human ships looked like something that had been built to survive. They were massive. They were angular in a way that spoke less of aesthetics and more of purpose. Their hulls were layered, thick in a way that my weapons analysis officer stared at for a long moment before telling me quietly that the outer layer alone was a composite she did not recognize from any Accord materials database. Beneath that, the sensor return suggested more layers. The ships were not built for beauty. They were built for endurance. They were built to take damage that would end another ship's mission, and keep going. And looking at them in formation, you could feel that intention in the shape of them. There were over 400 in this corridor alone. My communications officer told me that the same emergence pattern was being reported from 3 other corridors simultaneously. She said the total fleet count, based on combined reports, was somewhere between 1,300 and 1,500 ships. I looked at my tactical display. I looked at my 40 ships. I thought about Counselor Cronset's words in the council chamber. Decorative at best. My second officer, Terra, spoke at almost a whisper. He said that they had planned this. He said that the humans had been planning this since the day they joined the Accord. I did not answer him immediately, because I was thinking about the human ambassador's face in the transcript. I had not seen it, only read the words, but someone in my crew had accessed the visual archive of the session, and I had watched it later. I had watched her face when Cronset laughed. She had smiled. I had read that smile at first viewing as acceptance, as the polite mask that junior delegations wear when senior ones remind them of the hierarchy. I understood now, watching her face again in my memory, that it was not acceptance. It was patience. It was the face of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and was simply noting that it had arrived. The human transmission came at 0412, broadcast across every Accord frequency simultaneously, without encryption, without the usual protocol headers that diplomatic transmissions carry. It was a statement, not a negotiation. A voice identified itself as Admiral Hector Shendao, of Seoul Reserve Command. The Admiral said that they were not there to fight. He said that they were there so that we would understand, clearly and completely and permanently, that the choice had always been theirs. He said that humanity would be withdrawing to soul space now. He said that what we chose to do next was our decision, but that we would make that decision knowing what it would cost. Then the transmission ended, and the fleet folded. Every single ship, simultaneously. The corridor was full, and then it was empty. And then I was standing on the bridge of my command ship with 40 vessels behind me, and nothing ahead of me but the empty lane and the stars, and the sensor display that still showed the ghost readings of 1,000+ fold transitions, fading out of the energy spectrum like something vast had simply decided to leave. We held position for 19 minutes. None of my officers spoke. I am not sure what we would have said. I filed my report to High Command 3 hours later, when we had returned to our patrol station, and I had time to sit and organize my thoughts into the formal language that military reports require. I filled in the incident details. I filled in the sensor readings. I filled in the fleet count as best as we could estimate it. I filled in the description of the ships and their configurations, and the details of the transmission. At the end of the report, there is a standard field for threat classification. The scale runs from 1 to 10, with 10 representing an existential threat to Vethori security. I sat for a long time looking at that field. Then I typed one sentence into the comments box. I wrote, "Reclassify, scale insufficient." I submitted the report. I stood up from my desk. I walked to the observation window of my command ship and I looked at the stars. And I thought about a species that had been a member of the Galactic Accord for 14 years, sitting at a single table with a single vote, and observer status that amounted to a polite permission to be present, and had spent those 14 years quietly, patiently, without ever hinting at what they were doing, building something that made everything the Accord thought it knew about the balance of power in the outer spiral, completely and permanently wrong. I thought about the word decorative. I thought that Counselor Cronset was going to have a very difficult few months. They came to us 6 weeks later. Not all at once. Not in a formal convoy with flags and ceremony. They came quietly. through the back channels that experienced diplomats use when they want to have a conversation before the official conversation, when they want to understand the shape of the room before they walk into it. The Dralvine reached out first, through a trade representative who had personal contacts in Earth's Commerce Department, then the Storie, through an academic exchange program that had continued operating even after the treaty withdrawals, because academic exchanges existed in a space that the legal documents did not quite cover. Then the Geshens, directly, through mediator Prothik himself, who sent a personal message to my private communicator and asked if I would be willing to speak informally. I said yes. I said yes to all of them. I sat in meetings over the following weeks that had a completely different feeling from any meeting I had attended in 3 years on Thesivar Station. The difference was simple. In every previous meeting, the underlying assumption, never stated but always present, had been that humanity needed the Accord more than the Accord needed humanity. In these new meetings, that assumption was gone. In its place was something I had not expected to find so quickly. Not fear, not quite. Something more like genuine curiosity, a desire to understand, now that the picture had changed, what humanity actually was and what it actually wanted. The Dralvine trade representative, a careful being named Voss Selek, who shared my surname by coincidence and found this fact mildly amusing, asked me in our first informal meeting what Earth's long-term goals were. Not its short-term demands, its long-term goals. I told him that humanity's long-term goals had not changed at all. We wanted meaningful participation in the governance of the space we lived in. We wanted our discoveries to be recognized under the same frameworks applied to any other member species. We wanted the work we contributed to shared infrastructure to be valued as contribution, not taken as subsidy, and we wanted to be spoken to, in the chambers of the organization we belonged to, with the same basic respect that older members afforded to each other. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that these seemed like reasonable goals. I said that we had thought so too, for 14 years. The formal negotiations began in the 4th week. They were held on Earth, not on Thesivar, because I had made it a condition of re-engagement, not aggressively, not as a power move, but simply as a practical statement. The previous venue had produced certain habits of behavior that were not useful. A new venue, I suggested, might help everyone approach the discussions fresh. They agreed. I sat across from delegations from 22 species, in a room in Geneva with windows that looked out at the Alps, and we talked about what a new framework for human participation in the Accord would look like. The discussions were long. They were sometimes difficult. There were moments when the older representatives retreated into the formal posture of civilizations that have been conducting diplomacy for centuries and find it difficult to adjust to changed conditions. But they adjusted. The final framework that emerged from those weeks of negotiation was different enough from the original that it deserved a different name. We did not give it one. We called it the Revised Accord Framework and left the naming to the historians. The human delegation's seat count went from 1 to 5. Our status changed from observer with conditions to founding equivalent member, which was a category that did not previously exist in the Accord's organizational structure and had to be created specifically for this purpose. Resource Zone 7 was formally recognized under Earth's Discovery Claim, with a standard revenue-sharing arrangement applied to any member species that wished to operate there. The Communication Relay Treaty was rewritten with humanity as the primary infrastructure partner, with governance rights over the relay network commensurate with the level of construction and maintenance we had been providing for over a decade. There was one more clause. It was proposed by the human delegation on the 3rd day of formal negotiations, and it was adopted unanimously by the end of the week, which surprised me a little. I had expected more resistance. The clause stated that no member species of the Accord shall be subject to public ridicule, deliberate minimization, or expressions of institutional contempt within the council chambers, or any official body of the Accord. It stated that violations of this principle would be treated as conduct unbecoming an Accord representative and subject to formal sanction under the revised disciplinary framework. The other delegations called it the Voss Clause. I had not asked them to name it after me. They did it on their own, in the records of the negotiating sessions, and by the time I noticed it, the name had already become the one that everyone was using. Councillor Kronset requested a private meeting in the 5th week. I thought about declining. I decided against it. I met him in a small conference room in the same Geneva facility where the formal negotiations were being held. He came without aides, which was unusual for him. He sat across from me, and he looked at me in a way that was different from every previous time we had been in a room together. He was not performing for a room. He was not constructing a position. He was simply a being who had made an error of profound magnitude and was trying to understand it. He asked me how long humanity had been planning the events of those 6 weeks. I said that Pale Ember as a specific protocol had been in development for 2 years. But the underlying logic of it, the doctrine of strategic patience and hidden capability, had been part of Earth's defense thinking since the day we were given our single seat, and our observer status, and the quiet, clear message that we were welcome in the Accord as long as we understood our place. He said that we had never intended to use our military to impose terms on anyone. I said that was correct. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I did not expect. He said that was what made it frightening. I waited. He said that an aggressive species, a species that had built that fleet with the intention of using it to take what they wanted, could be planned around. Aggression has a logic. Aggression has goals that can be identified and negotiated with. But a species that builds a fleet of that scale and capability purely as a guarantee of the right to be treated with dignity, that is something different. That requires a different kind of thinking. I said that I understood what he meant. He said that the Accord had been wrong about humanity. I said, carefully, that the Accord had been wrong about what humanity was, yes. But I said that what I hoped, going forward, was that they would also come to understand what humanity was not. We were not conquerors. We were not interested in domination. We were interested in being part of something that worked fairly, for everyone at the table, regardless of how long they had been sitting there. He was quiet again. Then he said something that I think about still. In the months since those negotiations concluded, and the revised Accord framework came into effect, and life on Thesavar Station went back to something like normalcy, with all the old noise and the hum of life support, and the soft chime of translation networks, and humanity's 5 representatives sitting at a table that fit us now. He said that what he had taken for weakness had been economy, that humanity had not been hiding its strength. It had simply seen no reason to spend it, until spending it became necessary. I said that was one way to put it. He said, with something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of respect, that humanity was not what he had thought it was. I said that most things worth knowing are not what you thought they were, at first. He left the conference room without saying anything else, and I sat for a while by myself, looking at the mountains through the window, white with late snow, very still under a pale winter sky. What I thought about, sitting there, was not the fleet or the treaties, or the negotiations, or the clause that bore my name. I thought about something older than any of that. I thought about a species that had spent the first several hundred years of its technological life trying to destroy itself, that had pulled back from that edge through a combination of luck and stubbornness, and the slow, grinding development of institutions designed to make cooperation more attractive than conflict. I thought about what it costs a civilization to learn that lesson, what it takes out of a species, generation after generation, to carry the memory of how badly things can go, and the determination to do better. We had brought that history with us into space, every piece of it. It made us careful. It made us patient. It made us very, very good at building things that looked like one thing and were actually another. It made us, when the moment finally required it, impossible to underestimate twice. The Vethori counselor had laughed at the council table. 47 species had heard it. 47 species had watched what happened next. I was sitting in Geneva with the Alps outside the window, and the Accord was being rebuilt around a new understanding of what humanity was and what humanity could do, and I thought that there was nothing more to say about the laugh than this. It was the last time, not because the rules now said it was, but because everyone in the galaxy had seen, in those 6 weeks, exactly what patience looks like when it finally decides it has waited long enough. We had not started this because we wanted to end something. We had started this because we wanted to build something worth belonging to. And now, quietly, carefully, with the full knowledge of everyone at the table, we were going to do exactly that. The next session of the Galactic Accord Revised Council was scheduled for the following Monday. This time, humanity had 5 seats. We filled every one of them,